open your Bibles to Job chapter 30. Now this week we're going to be covering chapters 30 and 31. Now last week in chapter 29, for many of the women, it was probably as they read through chapter 29, they said, wow, that's my husband, because Job's going through a midlife crisis. Basically, he's saying, I was somebody. I sat in the gate as the king's representative. I was somebody important. I was respected. I was well regarded. I was feared by those who would do wrong. And I was especially feared by those who would take advantage of a poor person's status for their own personal gain. In fact, in chapter 28, Job talked about wisdom and where it comes from. And it leads us back to Psalm 110, verse 10, which is a common theme throughout the Psalms. It's also a common theme throughout the Proverbs. It seems like the idea of wisdom was very important to both Solomon and David. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Now, fear being not to cower in fear, but it's to have a respect of God. One of the reasons God uses the idea of father and son or father and daughter through his message to us is that's the type of respect he's talking about. That's the type of fear that he's talking about, is that he wants to have a relationship with us where we're not afraid to come to him, but we also need to fear him in the sense that if we do wrong, we're going to be punished. And a good understanding have all those who do his commandments. His praise endures forever. Now, where do we find his commandments? We find it here in the Bible. The interesting thing to note is Job is proclaiming the same thing, yet Job's the oldest book in the Bible. It was written somewhere to the tune of about 600 years before the Psalms and Proverbs and those other books. So we see that the theme that God has had for a long time has been wisdom. And also, where do we get wisdom? There's that difference between man's wisdom and God's wisdom. God's wisdom is divine wisdom, and it comes from his Bible. For Job, it came through word of mouth. There may have been writing, but you have to remember that they're not that far removed, less than 400 years from the Tower of Babel. Now, in chapter 29, we see how Job felt, how he applied that wisdom in his life. By applying God's wisdom in his life, it allowed him to be considered somebody important. Now, as you go through the book of Job, there is no doubt in your mind that Job had a relationship with God. Yet, in verse 29, we start to see the idea that he may have been more concerned about how others viewed him rather than how God viewed him. He really prided himself on what others thought of him. Yes, he was following the tenets of the Lord. He looked to God for that wisdom. And he did all the things that God said that we should do. He took care of the widows, the orphans, the poor. He didn't let a person's position, or a person's wealth sway his decisions. And he didn't let the status, rich or poor, be taken advantage of by those who would abuse him. But what we did see in chapter 29 is that, Job was full of himself. That he's a proud man and he is filled with self-righteousness. As we go through chapters 30 and 31, you're going to see that he still is. That even in the midst of all this agony and despair that he is going through, it still hasn't broken him of his self-righteousness. What we see is that the things that he was talking about in chapter 28 and mostly in 29, he was doing much of that for himself and not for the Lord. Think about this, folks. You can do everything right by the Bible, using it as your standard for which to live and for which you're to judge everything based on. Because there's wisdom in that, isn't there? There's wisdom, God's wisdom within the words of life and how to deal with life found in the Bible. It teaches us how to treat people. It teaches us how to treat possessions. It also teaches us how to mend relationships. Yet we can still do all of those things right and still be wrong with God. Because it comes down to relationship and why we do this. How do you ask, can this actually happen? Well, if you don't have Jesus as your Lord and Savior, who are you doing it for? How many people do you know that are really good people that know their Bible backwards and forwards but don't have that relationship with Christ? And then using the wisdom that they gain from the Bible, they take credit for those acts for themselves. The credit has to belong to God, folks. In Matthew chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, it says the following. It says, "Take heed that you do not do your own charitable deeds before men, to be seen by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father in heaven. Therefore, when you do a charitable deed, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may have glory from men. Assuredly, I say to you, they have their reward." Jesus is making reference to the Pharisees and the people who comprise the Sanhedrin, that the wealthy would take, well, first off, they were very much like Job's friends. God blesses me because I'm righteous. That's how come I have my wealth. And then what they would do is they would take 10%, regardless of what it was, and they would put it in bags, and they would take it to the treasury up on the temple. And as they're going through carrying their bags, or they would have beasts of burden laden with whatever treasures they were bringing, which was 10% of their haul, trumpets would be sounding, and everybody would be praising, there'd be singing, there would be dancing, a lot of them being hired by the person who is bringing this money to the treasury, just so that they could get credit for doing so. And Jesus is saying of those folks, hey, you got your reward. You did it for the praise of men, not for the praise of God. In verse 3 says, "But when you do a charitable deed, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your charitable deed may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret himself reward you openly." It's the idea of do it unto the Lord. Give God the credit, and don't seek it for yourself. That's where the rewards come in. It's because we're acting as doulos, bondservants unto God. If we do things in the same way that Job does, we're going to take credit for ourselves. If we do things to get noticed, to please others or ourselves, then we've got our reward. Now, last week was a difficult chapter. Many of us that sat through it were like, I saw a lot of heads down because we were really going over what self-righteous meant. I want you guys to think about this. Last week in chapter 29, using the King James Version, I went through and counted every time Job said, I. Now, there's 436 words in the New King James Version for chapter 29. Out of that, he uses the word I 20 times. So almost 5% is the word I. It's Job talking about himself. It shows us that Job was very self-righteous. He didn't say, the Lord allowed me, or the Lord gave me, or however. He took credit for the work that the Lord had done in his life. Now, moving on to chapters 30 and 31, they're pretty straightforward with the exception of a couple of them when it comes to the translations. Now, I just told you how important and wonderful Job felt that he used to be. Now, realize that for Job, that was only a couple of weeks ago. It's been maybe 15, 18 days since he lost everything to the point where he is right now. So in verse 30, chapter 30, he starts off with okay, this is how I used to be. Now let me tell you my current situation. Let me show you how quickly things have changed. I went from being somebody to being somebody who's being picked on. Job is now being, in his eyes, disrespected socially. He's in pain physically. He's been abandoned spiritually, and he's been opposed socially. He'll close chapter 30 by basically saying, I'm exhausted physically and emotionally. So getting a running start, starting in actually verse 25 of the last chapter, he says, I chose the way for them and sat as chief. So I dwelt as a king in the army, as one who comforts mourners. I was like a king. Now verse 1 and 30. But now they mock at me, men younger than I, whose father I disdain to put with the dogs of my flock. I was once somebody, now the children of the men whom I dislike. I wouldn't even hire them in order to watch as dogs to watch over my flocks. Even their children now come and mock me. Basically what he's saying, and this is a very interesting contrast, is he says that the men that I considered very much beneath everything in society, they now have no respect for me. In verse 2 he says, indeed, what profit is the strength of their hands to me? Their vigor has perished. Now, Job has just talked to us in chapter 28 and 29 how he was fair with everyone, how he was good to those who needed his help. But now he's talking about another group of people, and he's saying, now let me compare those people to me. These younger men whose fathers I disdain, the ones that mock me, they are no use to me. Why? Because they're poor and destitute. They have no strength or endurance. Reading in verse 3, it says, they are gaunt from want and famine, fleeing late to the wilderness, desolate and waste, who pluck mallow by the brush and broom tree roots for their food. They were driven out from among men. They shout at them as at a thief. Now these children, these are society's outcasts. They're living on the very edge of existence because they have no strength. They're out in the wilderness looking for roots to eat. And they basically, as they come to the gate, other people chase them off. Now, in every society, there are people that are like that. But one of the contrasts between Job and Jesus is, where did Jesus go seek people? Where they were, and those that were in need, right? On the edge of society. Whereas Job has just told us that I am this great and awesome man because I have helped the widows, I have helped the poor, and I have helped the orphans. But now he tells us there's a whole class of other people that exist outside the city gates that he feels is beneath them. So doesn't that mean that Job has just set the standard of goodness for what he thinks is right and wrong? Doesn't that tell us that Job just set the standard for what he defines as righteous versus unrighteous? Doesn't that tell us that Job just put himself in the position of God? Because who defines righteous and unrighteous? Who is the only one that can do that? Only one can do that is God. So by his own admissions, we see right here that Job, I'm this great and wonderful person, but when it deals with all of those people that everybody disdains, I disdain them too. In verse 6, it says, they had to live in the clefts of the valley, in caves of the earth and the rocks. Among the bushes they brayed, under the nettles they nested. They were sons of fools, yes, sons of vile men. They were scourged from the land. It's amazing for me to read this and realize that John the Baptist fits this description if you were to look at it from a Pharisee standpoint. Where was John the Baptist living? In the wilderness. What was he eating? And wild locusts, stuff that he could find, right? And so when the Pharisees and the Sadducees would come out, how did they look upon him? They looked up the same way Job's looking upon these people, with disdain. They live where the wild things live. These youngsters, Job is saying, is no better than their fathers. So he hasn't taken pity on everybody. He's taken pity on those he's chosen to take pity on. In verse 9, and now I am their taunting song. Yes, I am their byword. They abhor me. They keep far from me. They do not hesitate to spit in my face. Because he has loosed my bowstring and afflicted me. They have cast off restraints before me. It's interesting to note that these people that are living on the fringe of society, these men that the families that Job reviles, they don't think very highly of him either. And so now that he's weak, their children are coming in and basically poking at him with sticks is the idea. It's the idea from Job's perspective that I've lost all respect. These people wouldn't have even thought of coming near me when I was in my strength. But now that I'm weak, they'll come and poke me any chance that they get. These youngsters are no better than their fathers. It's the idea of, I had them pegged right all along. They were making up little ditties and singing songs about him. They're no longer afraid of him. They don't respect him anymore. Unfortunately, what's happening is those that have very little, he's not getting any compassion from them either. And that's actually kind of a shame when you consider it, because the ones that really should have the most compassion are the ones that have experienced having very little. And yet they look upon Job and they see, oh, how the mighty has fallen, and they're wanting to pile on. Not only that, but now this is Gary talking and we've been listening to the three friends who have been saying, well, you're the way you are because you must have sinned, and it must have been a secret sin because nobody can charge you with it. Well, the fringes of society are buying into it as well. They're saying the exact same thing. And then notice who he's blaming. Why is this happening? Because he, in verse 11, he is God. He has loosed my bowstring, meaning that I am weaker than an unstrung bow. An unstrung bow, there's no use of it other than as a bat. That's it. And notice that he says, and afflicted me. They have cast off restraint before me, that I was once respected and feared. Now I have no power. Verse 12, at my right hand the rabble arises. They push away my feet, and they raise against me their ways of destruction. They break up my path. They promote my calamity. They have no helper. They come as a broad breakers. Under the ruinous storm they roll along. Terrors are turned upon me. They pursue my honor as the wind, and my prosperity has passed like a cloud. Now, in verse 11, it starts off with, because he. Job is blaming God for all of this. He's now saying that his mockers, they come at me as a small army, making it impossible for me to gain any ground so that I can get better. And it's happening because God is the one that has done this to me. They're mocking me and making fun of me because God is allowing it. And Job's basically saying, I have nothing left to give. In fact, I don't feel safe anymore. All I can think about is how bad it is and how much worse it can get. Where's Job sitting at the moment? In the ash heap. Where's the ash heap located? Inside or outside the city? Where are the people that he reviles? Outside the city. Basically, he's saying that I once sat inside the city. I was the richest man within the city. I had all the respect. And now I'm beneath the people who we have kicked out of the city and that are on the very verges of society. And I'm fearful for my life. it's interesting to note, he's not trying to relate with them. He's still prideful. He's not looking for help from them. He still sees himself as better than they are. In verse 16, he says, "And now my soul is poured out because of my plight. The days of affliction take hold of me. My bones are pierced in me at night, and my gnawing pain takes no rest. By great force my garment is disfigured. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes." So not only am I no longer respected, and now I'm living in fear of my life, but now he's going to say, which many of us can relate to, I hurt. This affliction hurts me physically. It causes me unending pain. It's one of those afflictions for which I can't get any sleep at night. The pain just doesn't stop. That's what he's describing. And again, Job is blaming God for this. Verses 18 and 19 really say, if you want to go back to the translations, it says that God in his power has picked me up basically by the tunic and has thrown me into the mire or the mud. All right. And when we think of ancient mud, it's nasty mud. It's not like clean backyard mud that the kids play in these days. Now, Job ends this part of his lament with basically saying, "Look at me, God. I am sitting in an ash heap. I am covered in dirt and ashes." And he's crying out to God. He's saying, once I was somebody important, yet this is what you have brought me to. In verse 20, he picks up with that. He says, "I cry out to you, but you don't answer me, or you do not answer me. I stand up and you regard me. But you have become cruel to me. With the strength of your hand you oppose me. You lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride on it. You spoil my success. For I know that you will bring me to death, and the house appointed for all living." Not only is Job an outcast from his village, not only is Job in physical agony, in fact, it's so bad that he doesn't get any rest, now he's saying, "God, why have you abandoned me?" How many of you guys have felt like that? Been in the midst of a trial to where you're going, "Whoa, God, where are you?" Realize that there are times when we can feel both close to God and far away from God at the same time. We know he's there, but yet we can't feel his presence. Job's kind of in that same boat. He's going, "Why have you abandoned me, God? I have done all the things." He's kind of like Paul in the sense of, I have kept the law. I have done everything that I was supposed to do. But you regard me as being a sinner. Remember, Paul was saying that I held to the law. I did everything was right until I got to the 10 Commandments and read, "Thou shalt not covet." And then I realized what a sinner I was. But it often takes God taking us to that point before we realize those things. He's telling in verses 20 through 23, he's saying, "God, you've abandoned me. I cry out to you and you do not answer." Then he's asking the question, "Why are you so mean to me? Why do you unfairly treat me? Every time I think I gain ground, you take it away. You shake me." Now, he's making this, remember earlier in the chapter in Job, let me try it again. Earlier in Job, he said that the wicked are shaken like the wind before God. Now he's saying, "God, you're doing this to me. You shake me like the violent wind does. You're doing to me exactly the same thing that you do to the wicked." And he closes this little statement that he makes right here by saying, "The only thing that I have to look forward to is death. And God, you're the one bringing me there." Ouch. In verse 24, he says, "Surely he would not stretch out his hands against a heap of ruins if they cry out when he destroys it. Now, folks, this is actually one of the hardest pieces of the Bible to translate. You cannot come up with a single commentary that lays it out the same way. I connect verse 24 to 25. Now, one of the ways that you can, if it ends verse 23, where he says, I've cried out to you and you've basically not heard me, you have treated me unfairly. If it's a continuation of that thought, then the Hebrew can be, I am a broken man. I have cried out in distress and you have not answered me. It can mean that. It can also mean, I have begged, Lord, for your pity. But if you move it to be a change in paragraph, the exact same Paleo-Hebrew can then also mean, when the poor man has cried out, I have answered. Have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? That would be the continuation in verse 25. Or it also basically can say, I have never struck or mistreated a poor man. But didn't he just describe all of that happening? I tend to think that 24 blends into 25 rather than 24 being the end of 23. And it's based on how the poetry flows. Basically, it says, I have not mistreated those who have fallen on hard times. Continuing in 25, have I not wept for him who was in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? Basically saying, not only did I not mistreat the poor, those that have fallen on bad times, but I was also compassionate towards them. I had empathy and sympathy for them. I was sad for those that had nothing. He's basically trying to say, in my elevated position, I still could relate. I could still understand what they were going through. In verse 26, he says, but when I looked for good, evil came to me. And when I waited for light, then came darkness. My heart is in turmoil and I cannot rest. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning, but not in the sun. I stand up in the assembly and cry for help. I'm the brother of jackals, and a companion of ostriches. My skin grows black and falls from me. My bones burn with fever. My harp is turned to mourning, and my flute to the voice of those who weep. Basically, 26 through 31 say that when I fall on hard times, no one comes to help me. To those whom I brought light to, they're now only darkness. I am broken, and the only thing I have to look forward to is continued affliction. I have cried out for help. Nobody comes to my aid. It's the idea of standing up and saying, would somebody please help me? And he says that my cries are like that of the jackals and the companion of ostriches, meaning that everybody just ignores them. That I'm no better than the animals that are out there on the plains, that stay outside the city walls. And then he finishes chapter 30 by saying, my skin has grown dark and is peeling off from me, and my body burns with fever. He's like, not only am I helpless, not only am I broken, but just look at me. Everything about me is in a bad way. My skin is dark, and it's just sloughing off. Now in chapter 31, now he's going to recontrast things. So in 29, remember he said, I am righteous. In 30, he says, this is how I feel. And now in 31, he's going to come back and say, my integrity is still intact. Now, does that sound like somebody who's actually broken? No. In verse 1, he says, I have made a covenant with my eyes. Why then should I look upon a young woman? He basically says, I have made the promise to never look upon a young woman with desire. Verse 2, for what is the allotment of God from above, and the inheritance of the Almighty from on high? Is it not destruction for the wicked, and disaster for the worker of iniquity? Basically, he's saying is that, look at me and the man of wealth that I was. I didn't put away my wife and then marry a trophy wife. I didn't have mistresses. Yet I could be like everybody else and have done these things. Don't we see that happening in today's society? Think about how many millionaires and billionaires are willing to basically pay off their wives half of everything they own so that a 70-year-old can now marry a 24-year-old. It's just wrong. As a matter of fact, do you guys realize that when Jesus talks about divorce in the Bible, that's what he's talking about? That Shammai, there was the arguments of Shammai and Hillel. Hillel wanted to say that you could divorce your wife for putting too much salt in the soup. If she burnt dinner, that was grounds enough. When Jesus comes in and says, no, the only grounds for divorce is adultery, it's because he is siding with Shammai, who says, no, abuse and adultery are the only two grounds for which divorce is tolerated. Why did he have to say that? He had to say it because the Pharisees, the Sadducees, members of the Sanhedrin, they would put away their wives. They would divorce their wives. And realize this, if they divorced their wives, the wives had to go back to the families, and they would be given a small stipend so that they could then go and marry a younger wife. And they were actively doing it. So when Jesus is asked about when is it okay to divorce, he's talking about a specific issue, the same issue that Job is bringing up. He's saying that I'm a man of power, but I didn't have mistresses and I didn't have a trophy wife. I'm still married to the wife of my youth. In verse 4 he says, does he not see my ways and count all my steps? Basically, God knows. He sees everything that I've ever done. In verse 5, if I have walked with falsehood or my foot has hastened to deceit, let me be weighed on honest scales. Then God knows my integrity. It's a comparison between the scales that his friends are using, saying you've sinned and you're being punished because of that sin, versus Job saying, I haven't done anything wrong deserving of what I've been given. I'd rather use God's scales. And this is a scary place for Job to be, because in the next few chapters, God's going to come in and he's going to find out that actually his friends have been nice all along. Job is not righteous. He's self-righteous. In verse 7, he says, if my step is turned from the way, or my heart walked after my eyes, or if any spot adheres to my hands, then let me sow and another eat. Yes, let my harvest be rooted out. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or if I have lurked at my neighbor's door, then let my wife grind for another, and let others bow down over her. For that would be wickedness. Yes, it would be iniquity, deserving of judgment. For that would be a fire that consumes to destruction, and would root out all my increase. All that basically to say that if I have been unfaithful or untrue to my wife, then she should leave me. She should be taken from me, because I have not sinned and lived like others do. I've been true to my wife. I've been true to our marriage. If I were to have lusted after anyone else, that would be iniquity deserving of the judgment that's fallen me right now. And he's saying that unfaithfulness only leads to destruction, whether imagined or real. It consumes like a fire. And when it consumes, it'll take everything that's acquired. And folks, we see that today. We see so many that get involved with pornography. We see so many people who are running after thinking that, okay, well, this wife will be better and want to do the divorce. And folks, it actually can be really bad. And it's interesting to note that in most of the cases, when somebody commits iniquity within a marriage, the destruction that it brings upon the family, as well as upon the financial gains, it just destroys everything. But Barb just brought it up. Not only that, but that's material gain. But what about the emotional scars that it brings? What about what it brings with the children? Job saying, but I'm not like that. Job saying, I've been better than that. In fact, if I have done any of those things, let her go. Let her go be with somebody that can adore her better than me. And I will let everything I have be taken away. So he's basically saying that if I had done any of this, then where I find myself now would have been the right place. But I haven't done that. In verse 13, he says, if I have despised the cause of my male or female servant when they complained against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? Basically, what he's saying in this part of the chapter is that servants would grumble against him, and if he heard that grumbling, he would go confront it. And he would try to treat his servants in a way that he would want to be treated if he was standing before God. That last part where it says, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he punishes, how shall I answer him? It's the idea of saying that if I mistreat people, then how can I expect God to treat me fairly? In verse 15, he said, did not he who made me in the womb make them? Did not the same one fashion us in the womb? God made all of us, servant and master. So I have to treat them with respect since they are the workmanship of God. But I want to contrast this with what he just talked about, the people who live outside the village, that live on the fringes of society. See, he still sees them beneath him. He sees his servants actually higher than them. In verse 16, he says, if I have kept the poor from their desire or caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or eaten my morsel by myself so that the fatherless could not eat of it, but from my youth I reared him as a father, and from my mother's womb I guided the widow. If I had seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or any poor man without covering, if his heart has not blessed me, and if he was not warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I had raised my hand against the fatherless, when I saw I had help in the gate, then let my arm fall from my shoulder, let my arm be torn from the socket. Again, he's doing this contrast. If I've ever ignored the plight of the poor, or failed to take care of the widow, I deserve what I get. If I have ever eaten while the orphans of the village go hungry, then I'm deserving what I am getting. What he's doing here, folks, is he's putting up a comparison, basically saying, I'm in this position, and I say that I'm not worthy of being in this position. But if I had done this, then this would be justified. If I had done that, this would be justified. He's trying to say, I have done the requirements of God to the letter that God says that they need to be done, and I have, in keeping all of those things, I am not deserving of the position for which I find myself in. He's basically saying, I swear I've never mistreated widow, orphans, or poor. If I had, then I deserve to have my arm wrenched off of me. Verse 23, why do I do these things? For the destruction from God is a terror to me, and because of his magnificence, I cannot endure. He's basically saying, I fear God. I'm afraid of what God would do to me if I didn't do those things. I fear what God would do to me, which has now come upon me. What God would do to me if I mistreated anybody. It is because God's majesty that I don't do the things that the wicked do. It's because God keeps track. Verse 24. Now he moves on to the material things. He says, if I have made gold my hope, or said to fine gold, you are my confidence. If I have rejoiced because my wealth was great and because my hand had gained much. If I had observed the sun when it shines, or the moon moving in brightness, so that my heart has been secretly enticed, and my mouth has kissed my hand, this also would be an iniquity deserving of judgment, for I would have denied God who is above me. If I had put my faith into riches or material wealth, then I'm not serving God. If I secretly follow false gods or worship nature in any way, then I could understand the predicament that I'm in. Because in doing so, I would have denied God and his greatness. Job's hitting on the very idea that anything that eclipses God, that you put in front of God, money, people, power, regardless of what it is, anything that eclipses God, it's wrong. You've just created a false God. And he's saying, I didn't do any of that. In verse 29, he says, if I have rejoiced at the destruction of him who hated me, or lifted myself up when evil found him, indeed, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for a curse on his soul. Verse 29 and verse 30 basically say that if I had found any pleasure in the destruction of my enemy, or if I had found pleasure in cursing somebody. You ever hear somebody say, damn you? Well, guess what? That fits that number 30 part where if he'd ever done that, he'd be guilty and worthy of what he is saying. In verse 31, he says, if the men of my tent had not said, who is there that has not been satisfied with his meat? But no sojourner has lodged in the street, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. Basically saying, if I've ever been inhospitable. Verse 33, if I have covered my transgressions as Adam by hiding my iniquity in my bosom. Basically saying, if I have ever hidden my sin. When Adam and Eve ate from the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, what was the first thing that they did? Well, they hid first. Then they covered up with fig leaves, right? But they hid from God. Why? They were ashamed. They knew they had done wrong. Exactly. That's what Job is saying. He's going, I've never kept my sin from God. It's the idea in his particular case that the imagery of this is a man wearing a tunic and having a belt, but the tunic has no pockets. It's the idea of taking your sin and grabbing it and stuffing it in your tunic so that people outside cannot see it. He's saying, I haven't done that with my sin either. Not before God. Every time I've sinned, I've confessed. And you have to remember, at this particular time, we still had animal sacrifices. So he was still going out and laying his hand on an animal. And then that animal would have its throat slit and the blood poured out. Every time he sinned, he would go and do that. Rather than saying, well, this one's just a little one. It doesn't count. In verse 34, because I fear the great multitude and dread of the contempt of families, so that I keep silence and did not go out of the door. That's a lot of words to basically say is, I've never feared to deal with people directly. Gossip doesn't scare me. I've never really cared what other people thought of me. That's what he's saying. I'm more concerned with what God thinks of me than what others think of me. Verse 35, oh, that I had one to hear me. Here is my mark. Oh, that the Almighty would answer me, that my prosecutor had written a book. It's who will listen to my cry? Or more so, it's more of a lament. How I wish God would listen to me when I cry to him. He's desiring to see the charges that have been brought against him so that he could either understand or refute the punishment. But here's where pride comes in. In verse 36, he says, surely I would carry it on my shoulder and bind it on me like a crow. If I could know the charges that were written against me, I would wear it so everybody could see it. In fact, I would bind it on me almost like a crown. I would declare to him in verse 37 the number of my steps. Like a prince, I would approach him. It's the idea of now I would be able to enter the throne room of God and give an account for all I'm done. Now that I know these charges, I can stand up to God myself. Remember, his premise is that it's not that I'm not a sinner. It's that I have taken account of every sin, or I haven't sinned so badly to deserve the punishment that I'm getting right now. He's saying if my accuser would just, and who's he thinking his accuser is? It's God. He's blaming God for this, right? So if my accuser would just tell me what it is that I have done wrong, I could boldly enter the throne room of God and tell God he's wrong. Now tell me that that's not a prideful man. He's basically, the Hebrew really comes out to read more along the lines of, I would stand before God like the proud leader that I am. Verse 38, if my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without mercy or caused its owners to lose their lives, then let thistles grow instead of wheat and weeds instead of barley. The words of Job are ended. The end of chapter 31 is basically saying that if I've ever acquired any land or any wealth by illicit means, have I defrauded anybody, then let it be valued as worthless. Let God judge me by making the land worthless for farming. It's interesting to see that Job's actually one of those double-minded men, isn't he? In 29, he talks about how good he once had it. Oh, I was the greatest. In 30, he's like, oh man, I have it so rough now. And those that he holds in derision, the children of those people now scoff at him. They now point at him. They poke at him. He's sitting outside the city. He's now where they are, and he's like, I don't deserve this. Then in 31, he goes into, I've never been an adulterer or ever desire to do so. My integrity is without question. If I was unfaithful, let my wife be taken. If I have mistreated my servants, then how can I stand before God and consider or want to be fairly judged? If I have mistreated the poor, the widows, the orphans, then let me be physically broken. I have never found pleasure in the fall of my enemy, and I have never hidden my sins from God. Let my transgressions be written in a book so I could proudly show it to all of you, display it to all of you, so that you can see just how righteous I am. The common theme that is happening between 28, 29, 30, and 31 is that Job is coming from that position of self-righteousness. That he has been broken so badly that most people would just go, okay, God, whatever you want to teach me, I'll learn it. Job's not at that point yet. You know, amongst people who are addicts, whether it's narcotics, whether it's alcohol, whether it's anything else, they have to, what is commonly known as, find their bottom. It means that things have to get so bad and realize that they've lost so much before they're willing to change. The problem for Job is he hasn't found bottom yet. He's still holding on to his integrity and his self-righteousness as being important. But that's what God is trying to break him of. Last week we talked about what self-righteousness was. It was about taking credit for the things that God does in our lives. It's for the times that we want to be God and not let God be who he is. It's those times that we want to talk about our wisdom being more important than God's wisdom. We also talked last week about how, well, the definition of doulos is a bondservant, which means that he is master and we're a servant. And the Bible's pretty clear. Paul puts it very clear. John, in 1 John, puts it really clear. Where he basically says is that people, we fall into two categories. We are either Christ's or we're antichrist. It's one or the other. It's not both. That you serve one master or another master. There's a good master and there's a bad master. When we don't let God be God, then we're serving the bad one. Even though we're Christians, we're still saying, I would rather listen to him than listen to the one that's my sovereign. That's the choice that we can make. That's our sinful nature. Our sin wants to listen to what the evil one would have us say or lessen the impact of Jesus in our lives. But God's wisdom is something that is so much greater. You realize that God only wants the best for Job. You realize that one of the reasons Job is going through what he's going through is for us to be able to look upon it 4,000 years later and find ourselves in a very similar position. I hear people say to me, oh, you're going through Job? I've had my Job moments. I want to go, very rarely do people have Job moments. Very rarely does it get quite that bad. But a lot of people are smarter than Job. They give up a lot earlier. Job's holding on to himself. Job's not willing to make himself that living sacrifice. Job's looking at the cross and going, I can leave it over there today because I'm going to do the things that I want to do. That's counter to what we're told by our Lord, right? We're to present ourselves a living sacrifice because we are doulos. Now, in Christ, you are holy and acceptable. Salvation is not something that you acquire, you already have it. When you accepted Christ, that moment forward, you can boldly enter the throne room of God. But what I would suggest is that you check your pride and your arrogance and your self-righteousness at the door. Because I can't tell you how many times that I would do something like that with my dad and I'd get spanked on the way out. The thing is that we can look to God as Abba Father, but we have to do it respectfully. Job's not at that position yet. He's still self-righteous. He is still holding on to everything that he has about himself. Job's righteousness, although he has a relationship with God, his righteousness within himself is more important than his relationship with God. And folks, that's a big problem in the church that we have today. It's not, thy will be done. It's, okay, God, thy will be done, but let me put a lot of conditions on it. Or more often we see, sorry, God, you got it wrong. My will be done. And we see this eroding of God's laws, of God's tenets, of God's ethics. If God has declared it sinful, it's sinful. Who is man to declare it right? One of the things that I find fascinating about Job, though, is that I can relate to him. Not from the stance of being sitting in an ash pile and having things that bad, where I've lost everything I own and all of my family, and the only thing that I have left is my wife who is yelling at me, saying, curse God and die. I'm better blessed than that. Boy, I'm in a lot of trouble now. But I can relate to Job from the self-righteous position. I can relate to Job from the position of me crying out saying, I'm better than that. I'm better than this person. I'm better than that person, etc., etc. See, that's what I relate to in Job, is that I can be self-righteous. And that's something that I have to check at the door. The neat thing is that God loves you and you have the Holy Spirit working inside of you. Listen to him. Don't shut him out. He'll fix these problems. How many of you are scared of the thing that God might find in that closet that you've got like 48 padlocks up against? I know I am. Folks, he already knows it. Let him give him the keys. Let him open it. Let him work it. It's amazing to see what happens when we submit to God and his authority in everything we do. Don't let your relationship with God be conditional. Just let it be done in love. Let's pray.